happy that so many of you have stayed with us for the afternoon's programming in honor of the Radcliffe Institute's 15th anniversary. I'm delighted to see so many of you here again. If you were able to attend our morning panel, From Civil War to Civil Rights, you know that it drew on the insights of the social sciences, law, political science, and history, to help us understand recent changes in voting laws and voting access. Our two afternoon panels will highlight topics in the humanities and sciences, respectively. And to appreciate the importance of the arts at the Radcliffe Institute, I hope you take the opportunity to visit our two current exhibitions. Helen Mira's show of photographs in Byerly Hall is titled Hourly Directional, and the Schlesinger Library's exhibition is titled Judy Chicago Through the Archives, and it traces the career of this icon of feminist art through the outstanding collection of her papers that we are very proud to have at the library. Our first panel this afternoon, Gender and the Business of Fiction, will be chaired by Gish Jen, who has been a great friend of the Institute since its inception, and who is a triple Radcliffe alumna. I don't think there's anyone else who would fit this bill, Gish. She is a graduate of Radcliffe College and a former fellow of two Radcliffe Fellowship programs, the Bunting Institute and the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. In fact, she was in my fellowship class, 2001-2, and that's where we met. I am very pleased and honored that Gish has taken the time from her own demanding life as a writer to guide us through this important and complex topic that has received so much attention recently in the press and in writing and publishing circles. Gish has brought energy and commitment to developing this panel today because she cares deeply about the issues at stake. As an award-winning novelist and essayist who has written with great insight on the art and craft of writing, Gish brings extensive experience and a nuanced perspective to our discussion. Her own talents as a writer have been recognized by membership in the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and are on rich display in her 4 novels, her collection of short stories, and a recent volume of lectures titled Tiger Writing, Art, Culture, and the Interdependent Self, which critic David Damrosch has described as, and I quote him, a rare case of a book on writing that itself is a joy to read, end quote. I can't think of a better person than Gish, superb writer and astute analyst that she is, to navigate the thicket of gender and the business of fiction. You can read more about Gish's many accomplishments in the program card at your seat. Before I turn things over to Gish to frame the panel and to introduce our distinguished speakers, a few reminders about how we will proceed from here. As with the panel this morning, our hope this afternoon is to foster plenty of interaction among the panelists and with you, the audience. Each presenter's remarks, therefore, will be relatively brief. After the panelists have spoken, we will give them an opportunity to interact with each other, and then it will be your turn. If you'd like to ask a question, please write it on the index card that we've given you with a pencil, and we will collect these cards during the Q&A period, and Gish will draw from them as time allows. We hope this approach helps maximize this rare opportunity to hear from novelists and editors together. So I'll turn things over now to Gish, with thanks to her and to the panel.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Oops. Thanks so much, Liz. It's a particular pleasure to be doing this panel in honor of President Faust, who has been such a passionate supporter of arts and of women, as you heard. I remember when she left for Harvard Yard and how she said that now that a woman had a seat at the table, she's going to change the menu and change the table, and she has. And of course, we writers endeavor to follow her example. For of course, gender issues have plagued the arts from time immemorial. Happily in writing, we've been helped in this by an organization called VITA, which in 2009 began tracking both who reviews books and whose books get reviewed. The results were dozens of charts like this one for the New Republic. And here, as you can see, the red is male, blue is female. Happily, in some cases, there has been recent improvement, because of the pressure brought by Vita, as well as changes in editorial. For example, here are the new charts for the New York Times Book Review. And let me say that no matter how bad the numbers continue at, for instance, the New York Review of Books, the occasional truly outstanding woman does make it through. Still, given this sort of thing, it is perhaps no surprise that when the board of the Modern Library of America named the 100 best novels of the 20th century, its list featured 91 novels by men and 9 by women. And similarly, in 2006, when the New York Times Book Review tried to name the most important book of the previous 25 years, the nominees included 20 books by men and 2 by women. As for how things stand today, we might consider that all-important cultural arbiter, listchallenge.com. There, if having worked through the 100 movies to see before you die, the 100 foods to eat before you die, the 100 places to visit before you die, you are finally moved to tackle the 100 books to read before you die, you will be confronted by some by now familiar percentages. So the question is, of course, how different will the Modern Library of America Best Novels of the 21st Century list look? The answer is very much tied up with the fact that readership for fiction has always been predominantly female, and the fact that the definition of literary has more or less been not what those readers read. Many people took offense when the editor of the Times Literary Supplement responded to 2011 Vita count by saying, "We know that women are heavy readers of the kind of fiction that is not likely to be reviewed in the pages of the TLS." But in truth, he was in league not only with Nathaniel Hawthorne, who famously complained about a damned mob of scribbling women, but George Eliot, who wrote an essay called Silly Novels by Lady Novelists, and with Jane Austen as well, who laughed, "I could not sit seriously down to write a serious romance under any motive save to save my life. And if it were indispensable for me to keep it up and never relax into laughing at myself or other people, I am sure I should be hung before I had finished the first chapter." In short, while there is some disagreement in the literary world about whether a work of fiction is properly autotelic or not, that is, whether art is for art's sake or may serve a social purpose, most agree that it must make people really look and really see and really feel. Jane Austen concludes her note about what she can't possibly do with, "No, I must keep my own style and go on in my own way," and that is, of course, exactly right. Books that traffic in piousness, in formula, in cliché and sentimentality may make it onto a bestseller list, but they will not make it onto any other lists. Yet, such is the pull of the women's market, a market estimated by some as 70 to 80% of the market for fiction, that literary women are often dragged into the field of the very kind of fiction against which literary is defined. Witness these covers for Nobel laureate Alice Munro, for example. I know. And here are an old and a new cover for Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar. And in honor of President Faust's predecessor, Alice Adams, who won the Radcliffe Medal in 1997, here is the cover for her novel Superior Women. You can see how appropriate the artwork is for a novel about 5 Radcliffe women in the 1940s. Not that women are the only ones marketed in an astonishing way. Witness the sameness of the covers of books related to Africa. It is as if, as one tweeter said, they were all designed by someone whose principal idea of the continent comes from The Lion King. Now, with refreshing candor, an art director at Knopf notes that by the time the manuscript is ready to be produced, there's a really strong temptation to follow a path that's already been trod. If someone goes out on a limb and tries something different and the book doesn't sell, you know who's to blame, the guy who didn't put the acacia tree on the cover. That said, I must actually applaud the Knopf team, which in my 20 years of working with them has never pushed me into a stereotyped cover. Quite the contrary, I myself have had the great privilege of working directly with the legendary art director Chip Kidd on all of my hardcover covers. At the same time, I must give voice today, too, to the many women who've been strong-armed into accepting covers and titles that paint them with a sentimentality that is not theirs. Boston Globe book editor Nicole Lamy says, "I see this all the time," and the caps are hers. And I'm sorry to say that many members of the Radcliffe community have been treated this way, including a former assistant editor of the Radcliffe Quarterly, a Briggs Copeland lecturer, and both older and more recent grads. They have had publishers threaten to cancel their contracts, agents threatened to end their representation, and much more. The fear of reprisal should they speak out is also palpable. Of course, men are sometimes packaged for the women's market as well. However, the marketing is not thrust upon them in the same way, and neither does it stick in the same way. They are born with Teflon coats, if you will, that women must laboriously acquire via professorships or publications or awards. As for how well one's Teflon coat is actually working, one can get a sense of it via one's contact with the media. As Claire Messud can tell you, one can review the new translation of Camus for the New York Review of Books and still get questions about one's character's likability. And of course, she's hardly the only one. Former Radcliffe Fellow Allegra Goodman, for example, was asked on air why it was that so many of the characters in her last book made literary allusions, to which she answered, "Well, they do work in a bookstore." So are things changing? 2014 has very happily been dubbed the year of the woman fiction writer for good reason. A truly significant number of women have won major awards. And do note what's happened, for example, vis-a-vis the National Book Award since the 1950s. What's more, the cover situation for Radcliffe medalists is definitely improving. Still, when it comes to that modern library 100 best novels of the 21st century list, which is to say real cultural authority, there remains many questions, as we will shortly hear. Questions from whether only men can be geniuses, to what we see if we look at nonfiction, to whether man-trap covers are any help. As to what a man-trap cover even is, we turn for illumination to our first distinguished panelist, Elisabeth Schmitz, whose first foray into editing involved an unfinished novel by a completely unknown writer. That was Cold Mountain by Charles Fraser, a book that launched both its author and its editor in a completely fairy tale fashion. And from that fairy tale start, she has gone on to a fairy tale career. It's hard to say whether she has a taste for the long shot or is afflicted with some species of literary perversity, but by bravely betting on the marginal, the risky, and the unfashionable, she has become, in true Radcliffe style, vice president and editorial director of Grove Atlantic, and a figure esteemed by all. Writer Tom Drury says, "Elisabeth is one of the best editors I've ever worked with. She immerses herself in the work with an unerring perception of form and language, line edits with great care, and strives relentlessly to enable the work to succeed on its own terms. She doesn't let you get away with things, and she's a true ally, someone who cares deeply about her writers. I am grateful to be among them. And of course, we too are grateful to have her with us today." Elisabeth.
Hi, thank you, Gish. I'm very pleased to be here with Gish, Claire, and Anne in honor of President Faust, all remarkable women I've long admired. In just the few calls and emails that we panelists have shared leading up to today's event, it's clear our questions are as pressing today as they were when I first started in publishing 25 years ago. How are women being read? And are they being taken as seriously as men? To that end, a question that came up again and again is whether or not a large segment of women writers are, by default of their gender, being passed over as serious writers and their work perceived as a separate genre, women's fiction. And then whether or not a jacket cover may be to blame for these kinds of market crossovers or barriers towards being regarded seriously. First, I should explain that I work in something of an oasis within the world of publishing. Grove Atlantic is one of the last independent publishers, privately owned and buoyed by a valuable backlist. Unlike the corporate entities, the Big Five, Little Brown, owned by Hachette Penguin Random, owned by Bertelsmann, Macmillan, owned by Holtzbrink, Simon & Schuster, owned by CBS, and HarperCollins, owned by Rupert Murdoch's News Corp. Grove does not report to conglomerate parent companies who need to see growth quarter after quarter, year after year. I am therefore in the enviable position of being able to acquire the books I love: male, female, fiction, memoir, narrative, nonfiction. If we're passionate about a book, we try to buy it. The few times we've talked ourselves into publishing a novel we were on the fence about simply because we thought it would sell have been disastrous. In 25 years in publishing, my biggest challenge has always been how to sell literary books, period. I often find myself telling agents that their submissions are too commercial for Grove Atlantic, which is obviously a crazy thing to say. But what I mean is that we don't specialize in selling particular genres, which are often popular fiction niches. These might be chick lit, lad lit, celebrity books, or young adult. When Gish first called to ask if I'd participate on this panel about gender in the business of fiction, I had to tell her that I didn't know how useful she'd find me on this subject, as in all my working life, I haven't consciously taken gender into consideration when it comes to acquiring the books that I love. I assumed that Grove as a whole and I acquired about 50-50 women fiction writers to men. But when I studied it, I was surprised to find I acquired 2-to-1 women to men. When I looked at the last 4 years for the whole of Grove, I found that in fiction we published 86 male authors to 56 female authors, a roughly 3-to-2 ratio men to women in fiction at Grove. The same ratio was found for memoir, with 14 male authors to 9 female authors. The next surprise I had when I scanned my office bookshelves was that, of the last 2 decades, my most commercially successful books have been by men. Why? The issue here is twofold. Well, manyfold, really. First, we have to look at ideas of success and recognition as being determined either by sales or by reviews, what Salon's Laura Miller called the economy of selling books versus the economy of prestige. More often than not, big writers, be they men or women, find themselves in the more commercial domain of literature, those areas which reach the general consumer and sell a lot more than literary or so-called highbrow work. For now, let's say we are measuring literary success in terms of critical recognition, though of course we all want our literary books to sell too. So how do we market our fiction? How do we present the book to reviewers and consumers that renders it both true to its content and appealing to a book buyer? You don't want to deceive a customer into buying something it's not. It's our big dilemma then. How do we pitch upmarket books to a wide buying readership? The tools that we have in-house are the cover, the description, and blurbs from other writers. Those are the things that we can gather to ensure that when a book is launched, what is on the outside of the book most truly reflects what is on the inside. We cannot control reviews, sales, prizes. And this too is a dilemma for authors, torn between their dream literary cover and wanting the best shot at high sales. Recently, it seems that literary writers prefer type-dominant covers, and commercial writers, marketers, and the sales department want people on the cover. A quick example of this scenario is a new novel by Lily King. We had lengthy discussions about her new cover because it is a historical novel set in 1933 New Guinea, inspired by the life of Margaret Mead and the love triangle between her, her husband, and their colleague in the field, Gregory Bateson. As Lily's longtime editor, I felt this was a breakout book for her, and I wanted a cover that was unique to reflect a new direction. When the art department showed me a close-up of a rainbow gum tree, I immediately fell in love with it. When I showed it to Lily, so did she, and then so did the majority of the staff at Grove. The consensus was that it was beautiful, artistic, striking, and not typical of genre or historical fiction. However, we were met with anxiety about the need to make the book's content explicit on its cover, i.e., another sepia-toned image of a woman on a boat somewhere afloat on a river. Examples of successful books with historically accurate covers were cited, and Lily was torn between her dream cover or a cover that might garner more sales. A long debate ensued, which was ultimately won by our instinct that this was the most beautiful, apt, and arresting cover for this special book. The one compromise we made to indicate the historical element was to italicize the title font. So far, responses to this cover have been overwhelmingly positive. Euphoria publishes next Tuesday, so we shall see. There's a further dimension to cover art marketing when a woman author wants a book cover that will appeal to men. Why is this a concern when an estimated 80% of fiction buyers are women? Are women authors anxious about their male colleagues, the male critics, or concerned about being taken seriously? And what exactly does a man-trap cover look like? I'm not completely sure, but these are my guesses. Is Bob Shakochis's cover, For the Woman Who Lost Her Soul, finalist for the Pulitzer this year, more appealing to men? Or is Jamie Quattro's debut, I Want to Show You More, a book acclaimed by reviewers, including Dwight Garner, James Wood, and J. Robert Lennon in the New York Times Book Review, a more female cover? What drives the design of these splashier, brighter, more iconic, and yes, less gendered covers is the hope that all reviewers, readers, and buyers will be drawn to a beautiful object as well as a well-told story. I do think we have reached a turning point in the 21st century. Even though having women in leadership positions doesn't necessarily ensure change, our presence in publishing houses and the media in greater numbers than ever is certainly an evolving positive landscape for women writers. The editor of the New York Times Book Review and the head buyer of fiction at Barnes & Noble are women. Our two most prominent New York Times daily fiction reviewers are women. Women are the book editors at nearly every newspaper review section from Boston to Seattle. Women this year won the Nobel Prize, the Pulitzer Prize, and the Booker Prize. Though the National Book Award went to a man this year, the last three went to women. I don't know if publishing practices contribute, even unwittingly, to things like the 91-9 skew of the modern library list. What I do know is that if we keep acquiring and supporting good books and publishing them the best way we know how, the pool from which these list makers, critics, and judges choose from should be as deep and diverse as our writers themselves.
Thank you, Elisabeth. Next, we have Anne Holbert. Anne Holbert is a groundbreaker. She was the first woman assistant editor at the New Republic. She was a longtime contributor and editor at Slate, and she is now the first woman literary editor at the Atlantic Monthly. In the Radcliffe boundary crossing tradition, she's also the author of two books, a biography of Jean Stafford, as well as of Raising America, a category-defying social history of child-rearing advice. Our own Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer, Megan Marshall, recalls how much she has learned from Anne, both as an exemplary biographer of a complex woman's subject, and that, may I say, is high praise indeed, as well as an editor with whom she has worked many times. Even straight out of college, Marshall says, Anne knew everything about how to write a felicitous sentence and to develop an argument, and maybe more important, how to phrase her criticisms tactfully and create a sense of teamwork with the writer. It is truly an honor to have her with us today. Anne?
First, thanks to the Radcliffe Institute for hosting this event and for inviting me to join it, and thanks to Gish for chairing our discussion. I'm really honored to be on this panel on this big occasion, but I confess I'm also cringing just a little. After all, I could be mistaken for a part of the problem. I got my start as an editor quite a long time ago at one of the magazines, The New Republic, whose Vita numbers, Gish noted, are currently horrible, and I'm sure were even more horrendous back when I was there. Now, after a stint with Slate, which Vita overlooked in its tally, I'm newly and happily installed at The Atlantic, whose Vita numbers are only marginally better. And as if that weren't bad enough, I'm going to suggest that from where I sit, I'm inclined to optimism about gender and the business of fiction. But I don't mean to sound complacent. I say that more in the way of a warning. Women writers, critics and authors alike of all kinds of books still have a distance to go in the quest for cultural parity. On the way to that goal, what I'd like to ask is this: do we need or want fiction as a genre to be an embattled focal point? Or should we perhaps be paying as much or more attention to how women are faring as writers and reviewers of nonfiction? In search of answers, I'll start by looking back to the early years of The Atlantic a century and a half ago. I know that seems like ancient history, but The Atlantic helped create America's literary canon. How did women fiction writers fare back then? After that, I'll fast forward to my editorial experience of gender debates. Both exercises, it turns out, have their share of surprises. First, the early Atlantic Monthly. I was stunned to learn from a fascinating article by Anne Boyd in the journal American Studies that fiction in the magazine's first couple of decades amounted to a women's club. I had assumed the opposite, but by Vita standards, the magazine was off the charts on the fiction front. 70 to 90% of the stories were by women. This at a magazine hatched in male Boston Brahmin club rooms, and this at a magazine whose first editor, James Russell Lowell, envisaged a scholarly and gentlemanlike publication, those were his words, that would shape high literary culture in America. And this at a time when the mission to put the United States on the cultural map inspired rhetoric like this: where are the brilliant, the original, the noble works in whose publication we might take a lasting and national pride? American authors, be men and heroes. Do not leave our literature in the hands of a few industrious females. The young women writers who were welcomed into The Atlantic were kind of stunned, too, as they joined the star contributor, Harriet Beecher Stowe, in its pages. The magnificently bearded elite associated with the magazine were suddenly extolling their promise rather than dismissing them as damned scribblers. When the 24-year-old novelist Elisabeth Stewart Phelps's first story was accepted, and this was in 1868, her friends exclaimed, "What? Has she got into The Atlantic?" John Greenleaf Whittier and Thomas Wentworth Higginson sang her praises. Phelps herself paid glowing tribute to the then editor, James Fields, who with his wife Annie made their Boston house a place where women writers could mingle with regulars. Phelps marveled at Fields. This is her words: his fastidious and cultivated literary taste was sensitive to the position of women in letters. He was incapable of that literary snobbishness which undervalues a woman's work just because it is a woman's. Yet just about none of these early contributors ended up in the canon. In fact, many of them got dropped from The Atlantic as they matured, as editors came and went, as literary styles changed, and not least as market pressures shifted. The young women writers had felt they were being, and this is in the words of one of them, presented at court when they got into the magazine. But at the same time, they were caught up in a budget balancing and brand positioning act. For the editors, fiction was a tier below the serious essays that dominated the pages. It was a key to keeping the magazine afloat. It was a draw for the nation's thriving female readership, which better not dilute the magazine's literary prestige. No wonder the women writers got very mixed messages from editors whom they were very eager to please. The result was plenty of mutual frustration. Phelps concluded, as she bluntly put it, "I must go where I am most wanted and best paid." Other writers did the same, yet appearing often in less literary outlets, Phelps wrote fiction for children too, all but guaranteed they wouldn't be welcomed back into the Atlantic or be contenders for the canon either. And now I'll leap ahead to my own journalistic career. I got another surprise when the fallout of the first Vita count turned into a debate in 2010 over whether fiction coverage was a particularly egregious boys' club. Here again, I would have guessed the opposite. And my hunch was based on that still thriving female readership of fiction in America, and it was also based on my own experience. After all, back in my New Republic days in the 1980s and early 90s, when bylines were as male as the masthead, two of the most regular critics of contemporary fiction at the magazine stood out for their gender. They were women novelists, Ann Tyler and Joyce Carol Oates. And reviewing new fiction was the work readily available to us younger women on the staff. I almost surely wrote about more novels and stories by women than by men. But my guess that women fiction writers got equal or more ink was wrong. Vita doesn't break its data down by genre, so we got busy doing bean counting on our own. I did it at Slate, where I had since become the book's editor, and colleagues also looked at the Sunday Book Review of the New York Times. In both places, male fiction, it turned out, had the edge. The split was about 60-40-ish, and in the Times, men were much more likely to get reviewed in the Daily Times, too. But I wasn't totally wrong to sense bigger imbalances lay elsewhere. At Slate, we did better covering fiction by women than covering nonfiction by women, or than having women write nonfiction reviews. And when I take stock almost half a decade later, looking at 21st century book prize winners as a barometer, I'm struck by that lopsided pattern. I see progress for women on the fiction side and persistent disparities on the nonfiction side. Since 2000, half of the fiction National Book Award winners have been women. Women have won 6 of the PEN/Faulkner Awards to men's 9. And my cruise through the New York Times Book Review's end-of-the-year best fiction lists over the past 7 years turns up 18 women writers to 17 men. So as you can see from the chart, that's a marked improvement on a late 20th century count that Francine Prose did in a Harper's piece by the great title, The Scent of a Woman's Ink. But just as striking is the contrast with the nonfiction book award sweepstakes since 2000. Only 9 out of the 39 winners in the Pulitzer Prize nonfiction categories have been women. Only 4 out of 14 of the nonfiction National Book Award winners have been women. That's why now at The Atlantic, I find myself wondering about the wisdom of focusing on fiction coverage as a women's issue. The magazine's history, and my own too, suggests that emphasis risks inciting a certain literary snobbishness at women's expense. A somewhat different emphasis might serve the cultural cause better. Maybe that's why I've made a semi-conscious point of enlisting a man as a semi-regular critic of fiction. That needn't mean we'll cover fewer women writers who are doing so much of the really interesting work. In any case, I end up assigning more nonfiction, which is where a bigger challenge lies. Glance at this sobering chart of who writes what in newspapers and magazines. Or take a look at that other main newspaper book review these days in the Wall Street Journal's review section on Saturdays. It's glaringly obvious, you don't have to sift any data at all, that nonfiction reigns supreme there, and so do male authors and male reviewers writing about all kinds of things. Getting more women into that mix wasn't going to happen in the old Atlantic. It didn't happen nearly often enough back in my New Republic days either, when I was lucky to work with a stable of exceptional writers, mostly men. But when it comes to adding wonderful women writers, it's never too late, and for me, it couldn't be more exciting to start. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Anne. Critic Daphne Merkin called Claire Messud's latest book the novel that Virginia Woolf hoped someone would write, given a room and income of her own. But Sam Sachs of the Wall Street Journal went further, saying that the woman upstairs updates the dictum of Virginia Woolf's manifesto. It's not only a little money and a room of one's own that women need to produce art. It's a willingness to use and manipulate other people. It's a capacity for cruelty. No wonder that Robin Desser, her editor at Knopf, says that the thing she admires most about Claire is how she's not afraid of risk. An internationally best-selling author with umpteen awards, Claire has done more than push the limits of women's fiction, though. She is also a tireless advocate for the unsung. For all her richly deserved success, she has remained dedicated not to the blockbuster, but to the quiet, the keen, the meticulous, and above all, the defiantly, even violently, unsentimental. In short, to writers like herself who keep faith with things perennially undervalued but eternally invaluable. Claire?
Thank you. I'm rarely the tallest, but I think I'm the tallest today. I have to move it up. I'm always moving it down. It's sort of great. Thank you, Gish. It's wonderful to be here with Elisabeth and Anne and Gish, but also just thinking about gender in the business of fiction. Just before I start reading my prepared thing, it's particularly special to be here thanks to Liz and thanks to Drew. And when we talk about gender in the business of fiction, it may seem that Radcliffe plays a small part, but in fact it isn't at all true. In my case, my Radcliffe Fellowship came at a time when I had 2 small children and no room of my own. And I would not have been able to write my novel, not the most recent one, but the one before, called The Emperor's Children, had it not been for my year at Radcliffe. And in the present, ongoing, the generosity of Liz and of Radcliffe enables some of us, including Gish and me, to rent, former fellows to rent offices from the Institute so that we, again, have a place outside the home. And that is no small thing for those of us who have had the enormous benefit. So thank you. Now I put on my dirty glasses. All right. My mother had an adage for every occasion. I have no PowerPoint. She'd remind me that you don't attract flies with vinegar. I imagine many women here were raised upon similar ideas. It seems a particularly gendered metaphor somehow, why you would want to attract flies at all being, of course, an open question to which I will return. It's relevant because basically none of us wants to have today's discussion. We've been there and done that. We'd prefer to be reading and writing about other things. Virginia Woolf, almost a century ago, offered a marvelous treatise on the topic, A Room of One's Own. So too much later did Francine Prose in the essay to which Anne referred. More recently still, in 2012, Meg Wolitzer wrote a lively and intelligent piece in the New York Times Book Review, which you may remember. We all know that you don't attract flies with vinegar, but we're here again because the imbalances persist. The Vita numbers don't lie. While 80% of fiction readers are female, the tastemakers, our critics, remain chiefly male. The canon, insofar as the lists to which Gish referred create a canon, has remained to date overwhelmingly male also. In part, this arises because much of the fiction that women read is not literary fiction, as Gish pointed out, and is not destined for canonization, but this does not explain away the problem. There are various things to be said, and I think we all have been noting in an anecdotal way the optimism we might feel, certainly in this year in which Alice Munro won the Nobel Prize, in which Jhumpa Lahiri, Chimamanda Adichie, and Donna Tartt have dominated our literary consciousness, and when newer writers like Karen Russell and Rachel Kushner, who had one of the Man-Trap covers, have been so notably critically and financially rewarded, it seems perhaps churlish to dwell upon the inequities of the woman writer's lot. And yet, why do accounts of literary esteem register such painful disparities? Partly, it's a matter of the subjective tastes of those in power. Speaking crudely, Woolf observed, football and sport are important. The worship of fashion, the buying of clothes is trivial. This is an important book, the critic assumes, because it deals with war. This is an insignificant book because it deals with the feelings of women in a drawing room. That's from a room of one's own. What was true 100 years ago remains true today. If women ran the show, the much-lauded debut by a young writer named Chad Harbach a couple of years ago, which was about baseball, called The Art of Fielding, would have sunk like a stone. But the reasons aren't as simple as taste or conscious sexism, or even, in any straightforward way, unconscious sexism. It seems to me that at the root of the problem lie our unquestioned expectations and assumptions about the genders and our individual relationships to them. What do I mean? I mean that we want and expect different things from women than we do from men, and consequently from women writers than from male ones. The other day, while chatting outside school, a mother from my son's class described the director of the ART, the American Repertory Theater here, Diane Paulus, as a genius. It was a nice moment. I was struck for two reasons. One is that women are rarely given that title. As we know from the New York Times article in January of this year, parents Google the question, "Is my son a genius?" 123% times more often than they do for girls. "Is my daughter ugly?" is Googled 160% more times than the same question for sons. And the other is that I realized that if Paulus were a parent at our school, this mother would never have granted her genius status. You can't be a parent at the school gate and a genius. As my mother, with her adages, would have reminded me, familiarity breeds contempt. The irony is that familiarity is what we want from other women. As the multitasking, networking, socialized, and socializing gender, as the conversational, psychologically astute, open-minded gender, women expect to relate to other women, and we carry those expectations over into fiction. Men, who have also had mothers and whose mothers have most often listened and consoled and advised, may well want that also, insofar as they want anything at all from women writers. Although, interestingly, maybe it isn't what they want. My husband James had a conversation with Rachel Kushner, who was saying that one of her complaints, she's had a wonderful reception of her novel, one of her complaints is the number of times it was described as sexy. So maybe that's what the boys want. Could it be? If the presence of women in the libraries is distracting, right? But the role of the great writer, a European ideal of centuries standing, requires distance, authority, and a presumption of genius. It involves a certain projection of style, the stylus, as Jacques Derrida pointed out, being a phallic implement, upon the world. Genius is hermetic and imposes upon us. We respect and defer to it. We do not wish to engage with it, and we do not expect to see ourselves in it. Genius is godlike in Spinoza's sense. We learn to love God without expecting that he will love us in return. Genius cannot, therefore, show up at the school gate, smiling brightly and making plans for the potluck. It cannot be sweet. It does not consider its attractiveness. It does not accommodate. It does not seek to relate. This sort of ego is impressive, even appealing. It is also not common in women. It's up to us, then, to reconsider where we stand. We must take responsibility for our choices. We need to ask, as women writers, whether we should care about attracting flies, and we need to ask, as women readers, whether what the mainstream chooses for us is sufficient. Perhaps in the spirit of the Virago Press, founded 41 years ago by the indomitable and amazing Carmen Khalil, we need to forge or simply retrieve our own canon. We are the readers, we have the writers, we're no longer as insistently financially subservient as once we were. We can claim what we like. There are alternatives galore. We have the Virago Press, we have lists proposed annually by the Women's Prize for Fiction, we have our share of the mainstream journals, we have blogs and tweets and book clubs and word of mouth, we have resources like Radcliffe. We have indeed our feminine networks, our capacity for conversation. In spite of the conservatism of her adages, my Canadian feminist mother raised me on a literary canon of extraordinary writers, only a few of whom make the boys' lists. Virginia Woolf, of course, but also Edith Wharton, Willa Cather, Dorothy Richardson, Catherine Mansfield, Juna Barnes, H.D., Sylvia Townsend Warner, Elizabeth Bowen, Sybil Bedford, Jean Rees, Jane Bowles, Carson McCullers, Flannery O'Connor, Eudora Welty, Barbara Pym, Muriel Spark, Penelope Fitzgerald, Margaret Lawrence, Mavis Gallant, Gabrielle Roy, Alice Munro, to name but a few. I read and loved Hemingway and Faulkner and Fitzgerald, but these writers, these women writers, formed me. If I were to compile a list of the living writers whose work interests me the most, women would be in the majority. I pass discoveries on to friends like Precious Contraband, Lynn Ullman, Taye Selassie, Jamie Quattro, Michelle de Kretzer. And when the world recognizes them too, I rejoice. But I don't wait for it to happen. Who listens to top 40 hits on the radio? Who selects her reading from the New York Times bestseller list? When the fashion magazines try to sell you bell-bottoms, you don't have to buy them. When the critics of record try to sell you novels about baseball, you don't have to buy them either. As Elizabeth Bishop said, art is art, and to separate writings, paintings, musical compositions, etc., into two sexes is to emphasize values that are not art. But you can ask as a reader what it is that matters to you in art, what it is that you value. You can redefine genius. You can see it at the school gate if you choose. Each of us has the power to change the balance. And then, maybe, mercifully, we could stop worrying about how to attract flies.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. I think that one of the problems with this panel is that, we clearly need twice as much time as we have. So I think I'm just going to ask a couple of questions to the panelists before we take questions from you all. While we're talking, I do encourage you to go ahead and write your questions down on the pieces of paper so that they can be collected and forwarded up to us. But in the meantime, Claire, I love your call for women to rise up, make their own buying decisions, their own reading decisions. This fits in very much with what Drew was saying on, focusing on what can be. And I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about literary standards. I know that we've both sat on many awards committees. I myself have sat on 3 major committees last year, including the National Book Award for Fiction. And it was actually interesting just how much disagreement there is really about what the yardstick should be. Many of the scholars in the audience will recall Nina Bain's essay about melodramas of beset manhood and about the American canon, and how about the American novel is really judged by its Americanness, which is to say that the degree to which it conforms to the Central American conflict, which is seen by many as being between either the individual in confrontation with the wilderness or the individual in confrontation with society, with both of those things being gendered female, and the beset male being the individual, of course. So I guess the question is, what standards can we propose as substitutes? So we can see the inadequacy of those. Sheer size is obviously stupid. I think from Kant, we do have an emphasis on form, right? And we do see a couple of women kind of making it out on that yardstick, very particularly Lydia Davis and Alice Munro, who can both be very clearly to be seen as formal innovators, right?
That's so interesting, because I would think of them as I don't think of Alice Munro. I guess the capacity, what she manages to, the capaciousness of her stories is in itself perhaps a formal innovation, but whereas I think of Lydia Davis as a stylist in a sort of European male tradition, I think of Alice Munro almost on the other side as what I think of in a sort of French lit crit way from the 70s as a écriture féminine, if you will, that there's no ego in the text.
Yes, I would totally agree with you, but I would also say that they are not succeeding. They're very much not within Nina Bain's definition of what the American novel, and certainly what the great American novel would look like, right? So they are certainly doing something else, and I think that there is a yardstick going on. We could say that it is both a matter of form, but also style, right? So those things are linked, as opposed to they reinforce some American trope. right? But anyway, I just want to say, I'm just curious what kind of things, when you are on committees, I myself have often used, the test of time as a kind of yardstick that we might think about. The test of time, though, meaning things that might last for a variety of reasons. So that's a yardstick where, Uncle Tom's Cabin, Uncle Tom's Cabin then becomes a book of literary worth because it absolutely has lasted the test of time with good reason, even though in many ways, of course, there are many spheres of literary discussion where it would not. All right. Also, I myself have often looked for the genuinely new. So, certainly one of my touchstones has always been T.S. Eliot's essay, Individual Tradition and the Individual Talent. He talks about how the truly new makes everything that comes before it look a little different. So anyway, these are the kinds of things that have I think helped the conversation in various committees that I've been on. And I'm wondering if you might throw out, of course there are any number of these things that we could be using, but I guess maybe in an attempt to help any given member of this audience who's trying to think, well, what do I really think? If I am not going to look at the New York Times books, the New York Times bestseller list, I'm not going to look at what the critics say. What am I going to use to say, what I think is truly excellent beyond sort of what I like, right?
Well, I think there's some measure in which, do you remember that ad on TV? It's no longer there. Was it Size, Sims, something? The educated consumer is our best customer. I do believe the educated consumer is our best customer. It's not that I think people shouldn't listen to reviewers, but that you would need to read enough reviews to figure out which reviewers you trust. I think each reader has a slightly different set of
course,
of parameters. For me, all right, I'm going to nail my flag to the mast here. Human truth. I am after human truth. All right, and there's some way in which what lasts is always about. It must be precise and true in the immediate, and it must always resonate outward to have some greater truth. In that sense, any really serious book is a novel about ideas, a novel of ideas, not a novel about ideas, a novel of ideas, in this, even if those ideas are ideas about what it is to be human, if you see what I mean. Not ideas necessarily in the sense of, now I'm going to give you a novel about democracy, not that kind of ideas, but I think it has to be bigger than itself, which in a way is what you, in your introductory speech, one of the things that you were saying, we can set aside a whole lot of things that may be great in lots of ways, but aren't actually trying. And that question of Pound, of course, rather than writing an essay, just had that sentence, make it new. I do love this. I always tell my students, Pound used to say that the difference between Eliot and himself was that Eliot thought his readers were stupid and Pound thought his readers were smart. And I point out that we all read Eliot and we don't read Pound. Seems anyway. That's a digression. But I think it doesn't. The things that make it new are actually sometimes just the smallest shift in our way of seeing. It isn't something that is stylistically innovative like Pynchon is amazing and wonderful, but it is also hermetic, and it isn't the same as Alice Munro, who is actually much closer to our lived experience, much more familiar, and we enter into the text in a different way. I don't know if you guys want to respond to that.
I would say one thing that seems very important, that the readership that is female that gets dismissed is actually a very unique readership. We read men and we read women. Men only read men. So if you want to broaden, that's of course a gross generalization, but it actually, insofar as there is data, it seems quite true that women read much more widely than men. And if you want to broaden standards, there's no better way to do that than to actually be reading lots of different writers and deciding what you like and why you like it. And
Can I just jump in? I'm just wondering, we have to kind of speed along here. We're in so much time trouble. But just very quickly, if you had a book of criticism or that you would recommend to the audience if they wanted to kind of hone their own critical ability to think about, the way, larger resonance and these kind of things, do you have a book that you would recommend?
Are you pointing at me?
Yes. Any of you?
I'm married to a critic who wrote a book. What am I going to say? I can't mention my
I mean,
own
what else is there?
panel. I thought that was she set me up.
Okay,
Best book on the subject, I think.
okay.
It's a book called How Fiction Works by James Wood, who happens to be married to me.
We promised we wouldn't
For
talk
his
about
sins.
Okay. Anyone else?
Oh, that was mine.
All right. I think that there are many other books I would recommend for people who are sort of trying to sort out all this. Absolutely, of course, Henry James. Of course, books like Highbrow, Lowbrow by Lawrence Levine. I think is just very helpful in order to sort of frame your own ideas about
I don't know that.
what. Yeah, it's fantastic, and I very much a book also very important on the subject of the economy of prestige as opposed to the economy of sales. Lewis Hyde's book, The Gift, who is a Radcliffe Fellow. All these things, and I think we can come up with many, many more. But let me just kind of, since we have to kind of move this along very sadly, I'm wondering if, so we can talk about, how the individual readers can really transform the situation. But of course, this is like the environmental movement. You can focus on the individual, how long a shower you take. Right? You can focus on, your own recycling habits, and of course that's very important. But the institutional level is also very important. And so, I'm wondering, Elisabeth, if you might talk a little bit about publishing and what's going on in publishing today. There are several questions here, about the rise of e-readers and so on. And of course, what is on everyone's mind is the effect of Amazon and what that means, in terms of what people read.
Well, Amazon is, of course, the big elephant on top of us right now. As many of you might know, it's really reached the mainstream press, and the book expo is going on right now in New York, and that seems to be what everyone's talking about. And Hachette is really fighting our first big battle with them. Basically, what's happened is that Amazon, now having attained not monopoly yet, but certainly heading in that direction, over selling books, is now starting to squeeze publishers on the prices that we're selling the books to them. So they want better terms. And publishing is not a very profitable business. It's, the margins are very, very small. And Amazon, they wanted to sell books, and they've attracted everyone to come to them to sell books, but they have always been selling books at a loss, and they could afford to do this, or they intended to afford to do this for a certain amount of time, to get a huge list of people, learn all of your statistics and what you love, and try to sell you other things, so thereby becoming the everything store. The books is a tiny part, very minuscule part of their business. So they don't really, they're not looking to us, books, to make money, but they are beginning to squeeze us now. And it's very tough times. It's really very difficult, and the problem for all of us is, and for all of us publishers, is that if we can't break even or make a little bit of money, we're not going to be able to continue to buy good books. The literary books that we want to publish don't sell as well traditionally as the big commercial books. And the more we're squeezed by places like Amazon, the behemoth of book selling, the less we're going to have to pay advances. And it's a big cultural problem. It's really going to affect everybody.
You know, I'm wondering, you know, it's, of course, you know, economics, you know, is always in the picture, and of course, this very much ties into some of your comments, Anne, about Phelps and her having to go where she was paid most, and in effect, just the fact that she had that economic pressure meant that she was doing work where she would never be invited back onto the pages of the Atlantic. And I'm thinking too about Lily King and her very noble decision to go with a less commercial a cover, but, you know, I'm also, just as a fellow writer, you know, I just wonder what happens when you make that decision. What happens if her gamble fails and she is not taken seriously enough for the reviews to make a difference in her sales, and if she therefore kind of falls in between these two worlds and has really quite a hard time with her next book. I'm wondering if, you know, you want to talk a little bit about kind of what, you know, what she has at stake. And also, Anne, I was wondering if you talk a little bit about, you know, obviously cultural authority is very much an issue here, you know, and that's kind of, it's related to, you know, to Lily King's decision. And, you know, you had suggested in an email that perhaps fiction writers might sort of bolster their cultural authority by writing more nonfiction, you know. Of course, then that comes back to the question, can we really afford to be writing fiction and also nonfiction? But maybe you could also address kind of whether you think that is a useful strategy, if that helps establish women as people who are figures who don't just relate to others, but who actually have important voices and important things to be, that they need to say and can offer to society.
I would say I wouldn't tell writers to strategize to write nonfiction if they don't write nonfiction. But I just meant, I think the sort of cultural authority of women in general will be greater if women are seen as arbiters in the nonfiction realm and not simply sequestered into the realm of fiction, which I think really is important. I guess along the lines of your question, in a way, maybe this is making me sound like the, you know, indomitable optimist, but the world of magazine publishing is even worse shape than the world of book publishing. But there is a sort of curious upside, which is that at the Atlantic, you know, I work for the actual magazine, the print thing that comes out 10 times a year, but there is an Atlantic.com, a thriving online part of the Atlantic Empire, where all kinds of writers, young and have much greater access to publication than was ever true when I got started in journalism. Now, they don't get paid anything, which is a problem. And this is a problem I just don't think any of us in this business have solved. But for an editor, it's actually a very exciting time. I mean, I can find all kinds of young writers. I can read what they've written someplace and go track them down someplace else. And that's really a wonderful place to be, and I think it empowers many kinds of writers who in the past wouldn't have had any access to the places that do have cultural authority. So
yeah, and you know, on the positive side too, if we're going to have the kind of revolution that Claire has in mind, where writers, you know, readers are going to rise up and make a real difference. You know, it does occur to me that one thing that the ordinary reader can do is, if you do read a book which you feel strongly about, you can, you know, do post online, you know, write something on their Amazon page, wherever. Tweet. What? Tweet. No, but, you know, but there is a way that you can both buy the book and advocate for the book. And I do think that if many people do that it will make a difference.
May I just jump in? I can't help but think of Flaubert here. I feel that I feel as though the genius anxiety thing is the male anxiety thing. Fiction, because of the history of women, silly women writers, fiction has always made men anxious, male writers anxious, and they've always felt they had to be incredibly male, or else they might seem like sissies. And so many of our notions of high literary fiction come down from Flaubert. The idea, for example, that it's incredibly difficult to do and you need to spend a really long time doing it, but Flaubert had a trust fund. Right? And I think that's a really important fact that's often overlooked, and that many of our ideas about what is necessary for high cultural production stem from a particular elite world where questions like, will I sell more copies if I do this or that, were essentially irrelevant. And that template may also be crumbling. That, as nobody can get paid to write a book review anywhere, and fewer, well, maybe more and more people have trust funds, but I'm guessing the people with trust funds aren't that interested in reading or writing necessarily, you know? But I don't know. But maybe that template, maybe things will just shift. I don't know.
Well, you know, I think we are all hoping that it will shift. I think that, you know, of course, this is a problem not just in literature, but also in the visual arts. You know, Linda Nochlin wrote that very interesting essay about why are there no great women artists, and she also identified the problem in the visual arts as the problem with the individual genius and the way that that's constructed, and the fact that that figure is seen as someone who has some innate essence, right? Or that is their genius, that is their talent, that very importantly will emerge no matter what, right? So as I think she so sweetly put it, like murder. It will come out. But there is this thing that, you know, there's something about that piece of it which we believe that if a person is a genius, it will come out inevitably. And I think that, you know, if there's one thing that we need to remove from that picture, it is the inevitability, right? So, because I think what's kind of emerging here is, you know, it's very helpful to have deep pockets, you know, so you can make Lily King's decisions, so that you can write these reviews for nothing. Well, but the question is, what do you do if you don't? Except for that some people are making money, Elisabeth is going
Well, no, well, yes, and Lily King did not choose to make less money by picking that cover. We are banking on the fact that that cover is going to be more interesting out there than another copycat cover of other successful women's books. So it's risky, but maybe not. One of the jackets I showed up there was The Interestings by Meg Wozencraft. And she has traditionally been published in a very kind of women's way. I don't know, I can't remember them exactly, but this is the first time that her publisher Riverhead and she have decided to do a very different cover, and it was that other very colorful one that you saw up there. And it really has been a breakout book for her, I think. And I'm not saying it's because of the cover, but perhaps it has helped. And I did have that cover in the back of my head when I was thinking about Euphoria, but because I loved it so much.
Interesting.
And I thought, that's a beautiful cover, not just for women, but for everyone, you know. So that's with Lily. In terms of the electronic books are great. I mean, again, our challenge is to get people reading, period, right now, today. And it doesn't matter how they read it. If they want to read it on a tablet, on a telephone, it doesn't matter. But we just need to get people reading. It has been actually a tremendous boon for us, at least the beginning of it, as sales went up on electronic books. They've now plateaued, which is quite interesting. The biggest fallout, really, from electronic books is that the paperback market has shrunk now. It's really where it used to be that paperback sold twice as many hardcovers, and then maybe equal to the number of hardcovers once ebooks started. Now, paperbacks are often half of what the hardcover was. So that's, we just have to balance it. I mean, I've had some agents say, well, what's your problem? You're making all this money off of ebooks. You don't have to pay to print the book or ship the book or get returns or anything. And I said, well, yes, but we're losing sales in the print editions.
We very sadly have only time for one more question. Anne, this question is for you. I think that, one of the questions is how much difference will it make to have so many women in positions of power now? And of course, many people, when they hear those stories, they think, but the women don't always support each other. They don't always support, women's literature. But I thought that within that context, maybe the audience would like to hear a little bit about your relationship with Dorothy Wickenden, executive editor of The New Yorker. I think you guys are kind of a story of, a hopeful story about, what can happen now that we have so many women upstairs, as it were.
Well,
that was
Dorothy and I both started out at the New Republic when I think that we were the only two editors who were women who were on the staff. They'd never heard of a maternity leave or anything like that. And it really was a huge help to both of us that there were two of us. And we have now for, I hate to think how many years it's been, but even since parting ways, we show each other our writing, we actually show each other pieces that we're editing. And I think it does make a big difference. I can imagine there may be men who have similar relationships, but I tend to think of it as somehow somewhat womanly of us that we have sustained it this long.
And I might end here. I'm so sorry to have to wrap it up, but I might end here that it's exactly those kind of relationships that Radcliffe is here to foster. In fact, there are many, many, many of us who have all been brought together by Radcliffe, and in this, I would think of this very, very supportive and very, very productive way. And I do thank you all very much for having us. Thank you to Radcliffe for allowing yet one more creative encounter. It is a wonderful thing to have a place where these kind of conversations can take place.
Thank you so much, Gish and Anne and Claire and Elisabeth, for this really stimulating conversation. I think we're all going to go home and buy books, certainly read books. A reminder to you all that if you want to pursue the topic, there are suggested readings on our website.